The night hung heavy over Egypt, thick with anticipation and dread, as though the very air trembled under the weight of what was about to unfold. Darkness covered the land, but it was not the ordinary darkness of a quiet evening. It felt alive, pulsing with the nearness of judgment and the promise of deliverance. Inside the homes of the Israelites, families gathered in tense silence, listening for every sound outside their doors. Mothers held their children close. Fathers moved quietly as they prepared the Passover lamb, their hands steady but their hearts racing. Everyone sensed that this night was unlike any that had come before. God had spoken through Moses, and his instructions were precise, solemn, and filled with meaning that not even the wisest among them fully understood. Yet obedience was their refuge. They slaughtered the lambs at twilight, catching the warm blood in basins. With branches of hyssop, they brushed the blood upon the doorposts and lintels of their homes, marking their dwellings with the sign of protection God Himself had commanded. Then they roasted the lamb over fire, preparing the sacred meal with bitter herbs and unleavened bread. Every movement felt sacred and urgent, for the Lord had said that He would pass through Egypt that night, striking down every firstborn, man and animal, in judgment against Egypt's gods. But the homes marked with the blood would be spared. Inside each home, the families sat dressed for travel. Their sandals were strapped on, their cloaks tucked into their belts, their walking staffs ready at hand. It was a meal eaten not in leisure but in haste, hearts racing with expectation. The children whispered questions, sensing the tension, and parents answered with calm but trembling voices. The atmosphere was thick with both fear and hope, fear of the judgment sweeping across Egypt and hope in the God who had promised to deliver them. Outside, a deep stillness blanketed the land. The streets were quiet. The homes were shut. Only the soft flicker of lamps behind shuttered doors hinted at the life inside. Moses had told them that this night would become a memorial for generations, a night to be remembered forever, the night the Lord delivered His people with His mighty hand. But for now, all they could do was wait. Midnight struck like a silent hammer. At first there was nothing, only the oppressive stillness. Then, somewhere in the distance, a cry pierced the night. It was sharp, trembling, filled with horror. Another cry followed. Then another. And soon the entire land of Egypt erupted into wailing. It rose like a storm, sweeping across the country, swelling into a roar of agony. From the palace of Pharaoh to the smallest hut, death visited every Egyptian home. The wails were unlike anything the Israelites had ever heard, raw, desperate, haunting. Firstborn sons lay lifeless in their beds. Firstborn animals collapsed in their stalls. No house was untouched. Egypt, proud and defiant, was brought to its knees in a single night. Inside the Israelite homes, not a single cry of mourning was heard. The blood on the doorposts stood like a silent shield. The destroyer passed over, sparing every home marked by obedience. The people sat in stunned silence, listening to the cries outside. Their hearts broke for Egypt, yet their spirits trembled with awe. God had done exactly what He said He would do. Judgment and mercy walked side by side that night. Before dawn, a pounding came at Moses' dwelling. Messengers arrived breathless, terror etched on their faces. "Pharaoh summons you," they said. Moses and Aaron hurried to the palace, where Pharaoh stood shaken, his face pale, his voice unsteady. He no longer spoke with arrogance or threat but with desperation. "Go," he said. "Leave my people, you and the Israelites. Take your flocks and herds and go. And bless me also." The power of Egypt had collapsed under the hand of God. Word spread swiftly through the Israelite camp. Freedom. After 400 years of slavery, freedom had arrived in a single night. The people gathered their belongings with trembling hands. They took their unleavened dough, wrapped in cloths, carried on their shoulders. Neighbors, overcome with fear of Israel's God, freely gave gold, silver, and clothing, a reversal of generations of oppression. Mothers lifted infants onto donkeys. Elderly men leaned on staffs. Children clung to their parents as the camp swelled with movement. The Hebrews, once slaves, now rose as a nation marching out by the command of the Lord. More than 600,000 men besides women and children set out. A vast multitude of people, Israelites, former slaves of other nations, and Egyptians who feared the Lord, joined them. The procession stretched endlessly across the landscape, a river of humanity flowing toward freedom. As they marched, Moses walked among them with solemn determination. He knew deliverance had only begun, not ended. Their journey would be long, and their faith would be tested. But God was with them. A pillar of cloud rose before the people, majestic and towering, guiding their steps. At night it blazed like fire, illuminating the darkness. The children stared in wonder. The elders bowed in awe. The pillar moved, and the people followed, each step pulling them farther from slavery and closer to the promise God had given their fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But even as Israel marched, Egypt was drowning in grief. Pharaoh stood in his palace surrounded by mourning, his pride shattered, his firstborn gone. The weight of his loss and the humiliation of defeat burned inside him like a consuming fire. Though he had commanded Israel to leave, his heart twisted in torment. Anger replaced sorrow. Rage replaced humility. With trembling voice and vengeful fury, he commanded his army to prepare their chariots. Horses were harnessed. Weapons were gathered. The finest charioteers assembled. 600 of Pharaoh's best chariots, and many more besides, rolled into formation. Pharaoh's grief had turned into blind determination. He would pursue Israel and force them back into chains. Meanwhile, Israel camped near the Red Sea, unaware of the storm gathering behind them. The waves washed softly against the shore as families settled for the night. For the first time as free people, they tasted rest. They did not yet know that deliverance was not only happening around them, it was happening through them, shaping them into a people who would learn to trust the living God, even as an army approached. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when the Israelites sensed a strange tension in the air, an unease that seemed to ripple across the camp like a silent warning. The Red Sea glimmered before them, its waves shimmering under the early light, while the wilderness stretched endlessly behind them. Families moved about their morning tasks, children played near the shoreline, and elders rested beneath makeshift tents. Yet something felt different, as though the wind itself carried a message they could not decipher. Moses stood watchfully at the edge of the camp, his eyes scanning the vast expanse behind them. He felt a stirring in his spirit, a divine intuition that the story of their deliverance was not yet complete. The pillar of cloud remained steady, hovering in majestic stillness above the people, but even that did not quiet the uneasy flutter in Moses' chest. Freedom had come, yes, but Egypt's shadow had not yet vanished. and soon the entire nation would learn just how unrelenting Pharaoh's heart remained. Far behind them, dust clouds began to rise on the distant horizon, thin at first, barely noticeable, but growing thicker, darker, heavier by the moment. A low rumble trembled through the ground, faint but unmistakable. Some of the Israelites paused, their brows furrowing as they listened. The sound grew steadily, a deep thunder rolling across the desert floor. The wind shifted, carrying with it the metallic jingle of harnesses, the pounding of hooves, and the clatter of wheels. Sparks of fear ignited among the people as they turned toward the horizon. At first, the sight was small, just a few dark specks. But those specks rapidly multiplied, swelling into a massive line stretching across the desert like a storm wall. Pharaoh's chariots. Hundreds of them. Behind them, more troops advanced, armed, armored, relentless. The Egyptians were not simply pursuing, they were charging with fury and vengeance burning in their eyes. A wave of terror swept across the Israelite camp like wildfire. Cries erupted. Mothers clutched their children tightly. Men shouted in fear and confusion. Some stumbled backward, others fell to the ground in shock. The memory of shackles, whips, and decades of misery flooded their hearts. Freedom suddenly felt fragile, like a dream slipping through trembling fingers. "They are coming for us," voices cried. "Pharaoh is coming." Panic swelled, overpowering reason. People rushed back and forth across the camp, looking for escape, but there was nowhere to run. Before them, the vast Red Sea. Behind them, the most powerful army in the world. They were trapped. The accusations began almost instantly. Desperation sharpened every word as terrified voices rose against Moses. "Why did you bring us out of Egypt?" they shouted, their faces twisted with fear. "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to die in the wilderness?" Others cried, "We told you in Egypt to leave us alone. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die here in this desert." Moses listened, his heart heavy not with anger but with sorrow. He understood their fear. He saw their trembling hands, their tear-filled eyes, the hopelessness that wrapped itself around their spirits. They were newly freed slaves, not yet shaped into a nation of faith. They had seen miracles, yes, but they had not yet learned to trust when danger closed in. Moses stepped forward, lifting his hands to quiet the crowd. His voice rose strong and steady, cutting through the chaos like a blade. "Do not be afraid," he declared. The people fell silent, desperate for hope. "Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today." His eyes locked on the distant army, but his voice did not waver. "The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again." The words hung in the air with an authority that did not belong to Moses alone. He spoke them with the certainty of someone who had heard from God, someone who understood that deliverance did not depend on human strength but on divine power. "The Lord will fight for you," Moses proclaimed, "you need only be still." The people listened, breathless. The thunder of chariots grew louder, shaking the earth beneath their feet. Yet Moses did not flinch. He turned away from the crowd and lifted his eyes toward the pillar of cloud. And God answered. The voice of the Lord came to Moses with commanding clarity, "Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move forward." Moses' eyes widened, for forward meant toward the sea. Toward the impossible. But God was not finished. Raise your staff. Stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the waters, so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground. A holy fire ignited in Moses' heart. He understood what God was about to do. This was not the end, it was the beginning of a miracle that would be spoken of for generations. Even as Moses turned back toward the people, the pillar of cloud began to move. Slowly, majestically, it descended from its place before Israel and shifted behind them, placing itself directly between the Israelites and the Egyptian army. A thick, supernatural darkness enveloped the Egyptians, blocking their path, confusing their steps, slowing their advance. But on the side facing Israel, the cloud shone with a radiant light, illuminating the camp like a divine shield. All night long, the cloud held back the Egyptians. Israel was protected, not by walls or soldiers, but by the very presence of God. Moses stepped toward the shoreline, the waves lapping at his feet. The people gathered behind him, trembling yet watching with desperate hope. Moses lifted his staff high above the waters and stretched out his hand as God commanded. For a moment, nothing happened. The sea remained still. The wind silent. The world waiting. Then, a mighty wind burst forth from the east. It roared across the surface of the waters, fierce and unstoppable. The sea began to tremble, then to churn. Waves rose, then split apart, the waters pulling away, forming two towering walls of liquid crystal that reached into the night sky. A pathway emerged, dry, solid ground stretching into the heart of the sea. The people gasped. Some cried aloud. Others fell to their knees. The impossible had just become reality. Moses turned to the people, his staff still raised. "Move forward," he commanded. And Israel, with fear and wonder tangled in their throats, stepped into the path carved by the hand of God. The wind howled through the night like a living force, sweeping across the seabed with unrelenting power as the waters of the Red Sea towered on either side, forming walls of glistening liquid crystal that stretched high into the darkness. The pathway carved by the breath of God lay before Israel like a miracle etched into the earth itself, dry ground where moments earlier there had been only deep waters. Families gathered at the edge of the sea, staring in disbelief and awe. Mothers clutched their children, men tightened their grips on staffs, and elders leaned forward with trembling hands. They felt the ground beneath their feet, unable to comprehend that God had made a road for them where no road had ever existed. The pillar of cloud still burned brightly behind them, casting a warm glow over the scene, separating them from the Egyptian army trapped in supernatural darkness. But the moment had come to step into the impossible. Moses stood at the front, his staff raised, his voice steady as he called the people forward. And so, with hearts pounding and breaths shallow, the nation of Israel took its first steps between the parted waters. The air inside the sea corridor was cool and damp, swirling with mist as the wind continued to blow. The sound of rushing water echoed through the vast passageway, a thunderous reminder of the overwhelming power holding the sea back. The walls of water glimmered with reflected moonlight, shimmering like blue fire, moving yet unmoving, held in place by the will of the Almighty. Each step felt like walking into a divine revelation. Children pointed upward in awe, whispering to their parents as the water churned silently above them, teeming with unseen creatures that flickered like shadows behind the watery veil. Some Israelites walked quickly, eager to reach the other side. Others hesitated with every footstep, their fear wrestling with faith. But step by step, mile by mile, they moved forward, carried by the promise that God Himself had opened this path. Behind them, the barrier of cloud held firm, but the Egyptians pressed forward in frustration. The thunder of their chariots trembled across the still darkened portion of the land as Pharaoh's anger burned hotter than the fires that illuminated the cloud. He could not accept defeat. He could not let Israel go. Even after witnessing 10 plagues, after feeling the sting of judgment and the loss of his own son, Pharaoh's heart remained hardened like stone. And now, blinded by fury, he commanded his army to pursue the Israelites into the sea. The charioteers shouted, urging their horses forward. The massive wheels of Egypt's finest war machines churned through the darkness as the army surged toward the miraculous pathway. Yet the presence of God still blocked them, buying time for Israel to cross. The camp trembled with fear as distant rumblings filled the night air, but Moses stood firm at the rear, urging the people to continue moving. "Do not turn back," he cried. "The Lord is with you." The pathway through the sea stretched long and winding. The Israelites walked for hours, moving as a single great caravan. The ground beneath their feet remained dry, hardened by the power of the wind. Some carried torches, their flames flickering wildly under the relentless gusts. Others held tightly to their loved ones, whispering prayers, songs, and fragments of hope. Step after step, they crossed deeper into the sea, and as they progressed, the pillar of cloud gradually lifted from behind them. Slowly, the darkness that had held the Egyptians began to fade. Pharaoh's army suddenly saw the pathway before them, the same miraculous passage Israel was walking through. Without hesitation, Pharaoh ordered the charge. Chariots thundered toward the opening in the sea. Horses screamed and strained at their reins as the wheels cut into the damp earth. The might of Egypt surged into the passageway, thousands of soldiers rushing in with flashing armor and rising dust. Israel heard the echo of their approach, a terrifying roar rolling through the walls of water. Panic rippled through the people. Parents lifted children, urging them to move faster. Shepherds drove their flocks forward. Elders leaned heavily on the arms of younger men. The sea pathway, once a corridor of awe, now became a race for survival. But the moment the Egyptians entered the sea, the Lord moved again. From the pillar of fire and cloud, God looked down upon the Egyptian army with fierce judgment. Confusion broke out among the soldiers as their horses screamed and twisted, stumbling on unstable ground. The wheels of the chariots began to drag, sticking in the softening earth. Thick mud clung to the wheels, slowing them until they tore loose from their axles. Panic swept through the Egyptian ranks. Charioteers tumbled from their seats. Soldiers shouted, trying to pull their horses free. Chaos erupted in the corridor. "The Lord is fighting for them," the Egyptians cried. "Let us flee from the Israelites." But it was too late. Israel was almost entirely across. The first light of dawn began to break along the distant horizon, casting a faint glow over the far side of the sea. When Moses saw that the people had reached safety, he stood upon a rocky rise and lifted his staff once more. The Lord spoke to him with clarity and power, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the waters may flow back over the Egyptians." Moses obeyed immediately. He stretched out his hand, and the mighty wind that had held back the waters suddenly ceased. The walls of the sea trembled, their shimmering heights shaking as though the sky itself were collapsing. Then, with a deafening roar, the waters crashed down. The Egyptian soldiers screamed as the sea swallowed them. Horses, chariots, weapons, all were engulfed in the furious waves. The waters surged and churned violently, sweeping across the passage with unstoppable force. Pharaoh's mightiest army, the pride of Egypt, vanished beneath the crushing depths. Not a single Egyptian survived. The sea returned to its rightful place, calm and endless, as though it had never been disturbed. On the far shore, Israel stood breathless. They watched the waters settle. They watched the destruction of the army that had terrified them their entire lives. And a great silence followed, a silence of awe, of realization, of overwhelming gratitude. Then, slowly, voices began to rise. First in whispers, then in shouts, then in a mighty wave of praise. For they had seen the salvation of the Lord with their own eyes. They had walked through the sea on dry ground. They had watched their enemies fall by the hand of God. And in that moment, they understood that the Lord was not only their deliverer, He was their defender, their warrior, their God. The first rays of dawn washed over the shoreline like a gentle blessing, painting the sky with hues of rose and gold as the waves of the Red Sea lapped calmly at the sand. The turmoil of the night had faded, leaving behind only the rhythmic whisper of the tide and the breathless awe of a nation that had just witnessed the impossible. All around Moses, the Israelites stood in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on the place where towering walls of water had once stood. The cries of battle were gone. The roar of the waters had ceased. Pharaoh's chariots, which had thundered toward them with fury, now lay shattered beneath the sea, their threat forever erased. For the first time since they left Egypt, Israel felt truly, undeniably free. But freedom did not come to them quietly. It came through the mighty hand of God, and the people felt its weight settle into their hearts with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and trembling reverence. As the early light spread across the camp, Moses stepped onto a rise of stone overlooking the water. His face was illuminated by the glow of morning, his staff still clutched firmly in his hand. His heart pulsed with overwhelming emotion, relief at their deliverance, sorrow for the suffering they had endured, and awe at the majesty of the God who had fought for them. He looked over the people, seeing in their faces the reflection of a miracle that would echo through generations. And in that moment, a song, ancient and powerful, rose within his spirit. Not a song composed by human mind, but one breathed into him by the very presence of God. Moses lifted his voice, and the words poured out like rivers of worship, "I will sing to the Lord, for He is highly exalted. The horse and its rider He has hurled into the sea." His voice rang across the camp, strong and clear, and the people turned toward him, their hearts stirred by the sound. As Moses continued, the nation drew closer, forming a great assembly upon the shore. Men, women, and children gathered with wide eyes and open hearts, listening to the man God had chosen to lead them. The melody rose like the wind itself, carried over the rippling waves. Moses sang of God's strength, of the arm that shattered Pharaoh's pride, of the power that split the sea, of the justice that crushed their oppressors. "The Lord is my strength and my defense," he declared. "He has become my salvation." With every line, the memory of the night became a testimony of divine triumph. Israel had not escaped by chance. They had not survived by their own bravery. They had been delivered by the Lord, who had fought on their behalf with unmatched power. The people absorbed each word, their spirits ignited with worship. Soon the voices of the elders joined Moses, then the younger men, then the women, until the entire nation erupted into song. Their voices swelled into a mighty chorus that echoed against the cliffs and across the waters. They sang of God's faithfulness, declaring that He was a warrior who defended His people. They proclaimed His holiness, His majesty, His unmatched dominion over all nations. They remembered the terror of the Egyptians and the way God's breath had pushed back the sea. They glorified Him as the God who reigns forever and ever. For the first time, Israel worshipped not as slaves, not as oppressed people, but as a free nation, with voices strong, tears flowing, and hearts ablaze. Then something beautiful happened. As the last lines of Moses' song drifted into the morning air, Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Moses and Aaron, stepped forward. Her eyes were bright with joy, her face radiant with the light of victory. She lifted a tambourine in her hand, its frame catching the sunlight, its jingles shimmering like tiny stars. Other women followed her, each carrying tambourines they had taken from Egypt, never imagining they would one day use them in celebration of their freedom. Miriam shook her instrument, letting its rhythm cut through the still air, then began to dance with graceful, triumphant steps. The women joined her, forming a joyous procession that swayed and spun along the shore. Miriam lifted her voice, echoing the song of Moses but with a spirited refrain that rippled through the crowd like fire, "Sing to the Lord, for He is highly exalted. The horse and its rider He has thrown into the sea." Her voice rang with strength and passion, and the women sang after her with fierce joy. Their dance was more than celebration, it was worship embodied, gratitude made visible, a declaration that God had turned their mourning into dancing. The Israelites watched the women move in harmony, their faces glowing with the realization that God had not only freed them, He had restored their dignity, their identity, their joy. The song continued, weaving through the camp like a living testimony. Children clapped their hands. Elders raised their voices, remembering the long years of bondage. The men who had once feared death stood tall with renewed courage. And Moses watched it all with a heart full of wonder. He knew this moment would anchor Israel's faith for generations to come. The song they sang would be remembered by their children, and their children's children, echoing in the hearts of their descendants. A song of deliverance. A song of victory. A song that proclaimed that the God of Israel was unlike any other. As the morning wore on, the people finally began to settle, though the joy still shimmered in their eyes. The sea lay quiet and vast before them, its waters once again deep and impenetrable. The shore behind them, littered with remnants of Egyptian pride, bore silent witness to the judgment of God. But Israel no longer looked with fear upon the waters. They looked with gratitude, for the sea had become their passageway to freedom, the place where God had revealed His power and His love. Moses knew the journey ahead would not be easy. The wilderness would test them. Hunger, thirst, fear, these would challenge their faith again and again. But today, their hearts were strong. Today, they had seen the hand of God. Today, they had sung the song of deliverance. And as the people prepared to follow the pillar of cloud deeper into the unknown, one truth rested firmly in their spirits: the God who parted the sea would lead them wherever He willed. And He would not fail them. When the echoes of Israel's triumphant singing finally faded into the rising heat of the morning, a deep stillness settled over the shoreline, as though creation itself paused to absorb the magnitude of what had just occurred. The Red Sea stretched peacefully behind them, its waters hiding the remnants of the greatest empire's might, while the sounds of Miriam's tambourine still lingered in the hearts of the people. Victory tasted sweet. Freedom felt new. The air buzzed with excitement and awe. But the wilderness ahead waited with silent, unforgiving certainty, and it cared nothing for their joy. Moses knew it. He understood that while God had brought Israel through waters of salvation, He would now lead them into a land where trust would need to grow, be tested, and prove itself. And so, as the pillar of cloud rose into the sky once more, the people gathered their belongings, lifted their children onto their hips, and stepped forward into what felt like a world of endless sand and scorching wind. The wilderness of Shur stretched out before them like a vast, sunburned ocean. Rolling dunes shimmered under the intense heat. Jagged rocks jutted upward like the bones of the earth. The horizon seemed to melt into a wavering golden haze. At first, the people walked with energy, still carried by the thrill of deliverance. They spoke excitedly, retelling the miracle of the sea. Children laughed and chased one another. But after hours passed beneath the merciless sun, the heat wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket. Mouths grew dry. Sweat evaporated instantly. The wind stung their faces with biting grains of sand. By the second day, the joy of freedom began to crack beneath the weight of thirst. There was no water. Not a stream. Not a pool. Not a single drop to cool their tongues. The animals bleated in misery. Mothers whispered reassurances to crying infants, though their own lips were cracked and parched. Men walked slowly, their steps heavy, their hearts troubled. By the third day, desperation rippled through the camp. Thirst clawed at their throats, making every breath painful. The people who had sung praises now murmured in fear. Doubt began to slither into their thoughts. Could freedom really look like this? Could God bring them through a sea only to let them die of thirst in a barren land? Just when despair threatened to break their spirits, someone shouted, pointing toward the distance. Water! There is water ahead. Faces lifted. Hope surged through the crowd like lightning. The pace quickened. Parents lifted their children high. The entire camp pressed forward, stumbling, running, weeping with relief. The water shimmered in the sunlight, a small oasis surrounded by palm trees. They reached it with trembling hands, falling to their knees to scoop the life-giving water. But the moment it touched their lips, their hope shattered. The water was bitter. Undrinkable. The bitterness burned their tongues and filled their mouths with a foul taste. Shock turned to frustration. Relief twisted into rage. Cries of anger erupted. What are we to drink? The people demanded. Their voices rose harshly, cracking with desperation and disappointment. The bitterness of the water at Marah seemed to symbolize their own hearts, worn down, fearful, fragile. They gathered around Moses, eyes blazing with accusation. Moses felt their grief, their fear, their exhaustion. He knew that thirst could turn even gratitude into despair. But instead of defending himself or rebuking the people, Moses turned to the only one who could help. He lifted his voice and cried out to the Lord, pleading for an answer, for mercy, for a solution that only heaven could provide. God responded with quiet clarity. He pointed Moses toward a piece of wood lying near the oasis, a simple branch that held no obvious power. Yet when God commands, ordinary things become instruments of miracles. Moses picked up the wood and threw it into the waters. Instantly, the water changed. The bitterness dissolved. The foul taste vanished. The water became fresh, sweet, cool, drinkable. The people gasped in disbelief. Tentatively, they dipped their hands into the pool again. This time, the water refreshed their tongues and revived their spirits. Children splashed in it, laughing with renewed joy. Elders drank slowly, tears running down their cheeks. The bitterness of the place transformed into blessing, not by chance, but by the command of God. But Marah was not only a place of provision, it was a classroom. God spoke to Israel there, declaring that if they obeyed His commands and trusted His ways, He would protect them from the plagues that had struck Egypt. "For I am the Lord who heals you," He said. The people listened, their hearts softening like the water before them. They did not yet grasp the full meaning of these words, but they would learn. God was shaping them into a people who depended on Him, not on the land, not on Pharaoh, not on themselves. After their thirst was quenched, the pillar of cloud began to move again, guiding them toward a new destination. They traveled a short distance before reaching a place called Elim, a lush oasis bursting with abundance. 12 springs poured forth fresh water, and 70 palm trees spread their shade over cool ground. It felt like paradise after the harshness of Marah. The people settled gratefully beneath the palms, drinking deeply from the springs, letting the peace of the place sink into their weary bones. Children played in the shade. Families rested. The elders sat quietly, looking out at the springs with softened eyes. God had not only provided, He had comforted. During their time at Elim, Moses walked among the people, watching them rest. He understood something now more clearly than ever: deliverance was not a single event, it was a journey. God had freed them from Egypt, but He was still freeing them from fear, from doubt, from the habits of slavery. Each step in the wilderness was shaping them. Each test was teaching them trust. Each challenge was revealing God's patience and faithfulness. Elim, with its springs and palm trees, was a place of restoration. But it was also a reminder. If God could make bitter waters sweet, if He could turn emptiness into abundance, then He could lead them anywhere. As Israel drank from the springs and rested under the palms, they had no idea what awaited them next. That hunger would soon test them, that manna from heaven would fall at dawn, that water would burst from a rock, that battles would be fought, and that at the foot of Sinai they would hear the very voice of God. But for now, the wilderness was quiet. The people were safe. The springs flowed. And Moses lifted his eyes to the pillar of cloud, knowing that this journey, every hardship, every miracle, every step, was leading them toward the promise God had written long before they were born. The peaceful days in Elim felt like a gentle breath of heaven after the suffocating heat and bitter waters they had endured, but Israel could not remain there forever. When the pillar of cloud finally rose above the palms and turned toward the vast, empty desert once more, the people gathered their belongings, filled their water skins, and followed. The wilderness of sin stretched before them, a barren land lying between Elim and Mount Sinai, its surface cracked and lifeless, its heat rising in shimmering waves. The memory of Egypt lingered like a ghost in their minds, both terrible and strangely comforting, for though Egypt had been a place of chains, it had also been a place where bread was always within reach. As the days passed and the last of their provisions dwindled, the murmur of concern began to spread like smoke through the camp. Mothers looked anxiously at their children. Men pressed their hands against empty sacks. Hunger settled into the people with sharp, insistent claws. By the 15th day of the second month after leaving Egypt, the grumbling grew into open complaint. The people gathered in clusters, voices rising with frustration and fear. They found Moses and Aaron at the front of the camp, and a wave of bitterness poured out. "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt," they cried, "where we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us into this wilderness to starve this whole assembly to death." Their words stung, not because of insult, but because of their blindness to the miracles they had seen. Had they already forgotten the sea split before them? Had they forgotten the water made sweet or the springs of Elim? Yet hunger can bend memory, twisting hardship until it starts to look like comfort. Moses listened with a heavy heart. He knew the people were not rebelling against him, but against the Lord. Still, he lifted his eyes toward heaven, silently pleading for help. And God answered with astonishing grace. The Lord spoke to Moses, his voice steady and filled with patient authority. "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people shall go out each day and gather enough for that day. In this I will test them, whether they will walk in my law or not." Bread from heaven. Moses could hardly imagine what such provision might look like, yet he knew that God never promised lightly. He gathered the people and declared, "This evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, and in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord." The people listened skeptically, their empty stomachs gnawing at their hope. That evening, as the sun sank beneath the horizon and the heat of the day faded, a deep humming sound rolled across the wilderness. The sky darkened with movement, an enormous flock of quail sweeping like a living cloud over the desert before settling across the camp. The birds filled the ground, weary from flight, easy to gather. The people rushed forward with joy, scooping them up as laughter and relief echoed across the dunes. Families roasted the quail and ate until their hunger eased. But the true miracle had not yet come. At dawn the next morning, a strange silence settled over the camp. The air felt cool and still. As the people emerged from their tents, they saw that the ground around them was covered with a thin layer of dew. When the dew lifted with the rising sun, something small and delicate remained scattered across the desert floor, fine flakes, white and glistening like frost. The people stared in confusion. They had never seen anything like it. "What is it?" they asked one another. Moses stepped forward and proclaimed, "This is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. Manna. Bread from heaven." The people bent down to gather it, tasting it cautiously. It was sweet, light, and satisfying, like wafers made with honey. A miracle resting on the ground each morning. But God set instructions. Each household was to gather only enough for the day. No more. No less. Moses warned them not to store any until morning. Yet some, driven by fear of scarcity, hid extra in their tents. The next day, when they checked their secret stores, horror spread across their faces. The manna had rotted. It crawled with maggots and filled the air with a foul stench. Moses grieved their lack of trust. This bread was not meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be received daily, like trust itself. On the 6th day, something different happened. The people gathered twice as much, and when the leaders came to Moses for an explanation, he told them, "Tomorrow is a day of rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil. Keep the rest until morning." The people obeyed, and the next morning the manna remained fresh, no rot, no worms, no stench. A miracle within a miracle. God not only fed them but gave them rest. Still, even with all this, some of the people went out on the Sabbath to gather, but found nothing. Moses shook his head as the Lord spoke with gentle disappointment. "How long will you refuse to keep my commands? See, I have given you the Sabbath." The wilderness was not simply a place of need, it was a place of teaching. God was shaping Israel to trust Him each day, to rest in Him each week, and to believe that the one who split the sea could also sustain their bodies. Day after day, the manna appeared. It became the rhythm of their lives: morning provision, evening quail, rest on the seventh day. Children grew up with its sweetness on their tongues. Elders learned to gather their portion slowly, marveling at God's faithfulness. Even Moses, who had witnessed God's wonders from burning bush to parted sea, found himself humbled anew by the daily mercy that appeared with the dawn. To preserve the memory of this miracle, the Lord instructed Moses to store a measure of manna in a jar and keep it for future generations. When the people arrived at Sinai, this jar would be placed before the Lord as a testimony, a reminder that God provided for His people not once or twice, but every day, without fail. In the wilderness of hunger, Israel learned the tender truth that God feeds not only the body but the soul. He teaches dependence, shapes trust, and reveals Himself through the quiet miracle of daily bread. And though the wilderness stretched on and the journey remained long, each morning the people opened their eyes to see the ground glistening with God's promise. Bread from heaven. Grace on the sand. A reminder that the Lord who delivered them would never abandon them. The manna continued to appear each morning like a silent miracle scattered across the desert floor, and the people gathered it gratefully, learning to trust the God who sustained them daily. Yet the wilderness was vast and ever-changing, and as Israel continued its journey following the pillar of cloud, the land shifted once more, this time into a region even harsher than the wilderness of sin. Jagged cliffs rose on either side like ancient sentinels, their shadows long and cold despite the burning sun above. Valleys cut deep into the earth, dry and stony, and the path ahead seemed to twist endlessly through unforgiving terrain. As the people marched forward, the weight of the desert pressed upon them, and soon another need rose sharply and painfully: water. Their skins began to dry. Their animals walked with heads low. Thirst crept back into their bodies, slow but merciless, spreading panic through the camp. Manna could fill their stomachs, but without water, life itself hung by a thread. At last, they reached a place called Rephidim, a barren valley where the sun scorched relentlessly and every breath scraped against the throat like sand. The people scanned the land desperately. They dug into the dry earth with trembling hands. They searched the cliffs for any sign of dripping moisture. But there was nothing. Not a spring. Not a trickle. Not the faintest whisper of water. The air shimmered with heat, and the desperation that had once risen at Marah now surged again, but fiercer, sharper, fueled by the memory of past hardship. Fear pushed the people to the edge, and their hope flickered like a fading flame. Soon voices rose, harsh, accusing, trembling with panic. The people confronted Moses, surrounding him with anger thick enough to feel. "Give us water to drink," they demanded. Their eyes burned with frustration, and Moses saw the exhaustion in their faces. He heard the parched rasp in their voices. But he also heard something deeper. Fear turned into rebellion. "Why do you quarrel with me?" Moses asked. "Why do you test the Lord?" But his words only fueled their anger. The people cried out, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst?" Their accusations pierced the air like arrows. Moses felt the weight of their desperation. He knew they were moments away from turning violent. He felt the heat rising behind him, anger mixed with despair, and he cried out to the Lord, "What am I to do with these people? They are almost ready to stone me." God answered with steady authority, unshaken by the panic of the people. "Walk on ahead of the people," he told Moses, "and take some of the elders with you. And take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile." The staff. The same instrument through which God had unleashed plagues upon Egypt. The same staff that parted the sea. Moses felt the weight of it in his hand, a reminder that nothing was impossible with God. As he gathered the elders, the people watched with anxious eyes. Some whispered in frustration, others stared with hollow hope. Moses walked toward a great rock at Horeb, its surface massive and unyielding, rising like a monument of impossibility. The elders followed silently. The desert was still, no wind, no sound, only the harsh breath of men waiting for a miracle. Moses approached the rock, lifting his staff as God had commanded. And there, before the watching eyes of the elders, Moses struck the rock. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden crack, the stone split. Water burst forth in a powerful stream, cascading into the dust with a sound like thunder. It splashed across the ground, forming pools and flowing in clear, abundant waves. The elders gasped. Water, fresh, cool, life-giving, rushed from the very place where no life could possibly exist. When the people saw the water streaming down from the rock, their despair broke into cries of relief. They ran toward it, cupping their hands, drinking deeply, splashing their faces, filling jars and skins. Children laughed through tears of joy. Animals lifted their heads and drank eagerly. The people who had been ready to stone Moses now fell to their knees, overwhelmed by gratitude and amazement. God had once again provided in a place where survival seemed impossible. He had turned a barren rock into a fountain of blessing. Moses named the place Massah and Meribah, testing and quarreling, because there the Israelites had asked, "Is the Lord among us or not?" But the lesson of the rock went deeper than water. God was teaching Israel that his presence was not dependent on circumstances. He was not only with them at the Red Sea or at Elim or when the manna fell. He was with them in the dry valleys, the barren places, the moments of fear and doubt. He was not bound by the limitations of the land. He did not need springs or rivers to sustain his people. He could bring water from stone, life from desolation, hope from despair. While the people drank, Moses stood slightly apart, watching the water flow. He remembered the Nile turned to blood, the sea walls rising, the staff lifted high in battle against Egypt. And now this, water from a rock. Each miracle whispered the same truth: God was forming Israel not just into a nation, but into a people who trusted him with their whole hearts. Yet Moses knew that trust did not grow in comfort. It grew in need, in struggle. In wilderness. As the last rays of daylight stretched across the desert, the people settled beside the flowing water, refreshed and revived. For now, the thirst had been quenched. God had once again shown his faithfulness. And though the journey ahead remained unknown, and the wilderness still held trials yet to come, the sound of water flowing from the rock echoed through the valley like a promise. The Lord was indeed among them. The camp at Rephidim, once filled with cries of desperation, now pulsed with the renewed strength that flowed from the rock Moses struck at Horeb. Water streamed freely across the ground, pooling in shallow basins where families gathered to fill their jars, wash their faces, and soothe the thirst that had clawed at them like a relentless beast. Children splashed and laughed, animals drank deeply, and weary hearts finally found a moment of peace. Yet the wilderness seldom allowed rest for long. As Israel settled beside the miraculous water, an unseen threat moved across the desert, a nomadic tribe known as the Amalekites, fierce warriors of the south who preyed on the weak and vulnerable. They had watched Israel from afar, seeing the massive caravan stretch across the land like an unprotected flock. And now, sensing opportunity, Amalek prepared for war. The attack came suddenly, without warning. Screams erupted from the outskirts of the camp as Amalekite raiders charged in from behind, targeting the stragglers, the elderly, the weak, and those too tired to keep pace with the main group. Mothers clutched their children and fled. Shepherds tried to shield their flocks. The warriors of Amalek struck with swift brutality, their blades glinting under the desert sun. Panic rippled through the people as chaos broke out along the rear lines. Moses, alerted by the cries, rushed toward the commotion along with Aaron and Hur. His face darkened with righteous anger. This enemy had chosen to strike the defenseless. This was not merely an attack, it was a challenge to the God who had delivered Israel. Moses called for Joshua, the young man who had risen among the people as a capable leader, strong, courageous, and steadfast. Joshua arrived quickly, his eyes sharp with concern. He had seen the raiders. He knew the danger. Moses looked at him with firm resolve and said, "Choose some of our men and go out to fight Amalek. Tomorrow, I will stand on the hilltop with the staff of God in my hand." Joshua nodded, understanding both the weight of the command and the faith behind it. Israel had never fought an organized battle before. They were former slaves, not trained soldiers. But they would fight, not alone, not by their own strength, but under the power of the God who led them. As night fell, Joshua moved through the camp, choosing men who were young, strong, or willing to defend their people regardless of skill. Fathers kissed their children, unsure of what dawn would bring. Mothers prayed in hushed whispers. Elders watched with solemn faces, knowing that the coming battle would test not only Israel's bodies but their faith. The Amalekites camped nearby, confident in their experience and weapons. They expected an easy victory. But they did not understand the power behind the people they sought to destroy. When morning came, the desert sky glowed with the first light of dawn. Joshua assembled his men at the edge of the camp, each carrying whatever weapon they could fashion, staffs, slings, knives, and a few Egyptian blades carried from the Red Sea crossing. Though their gear was simple, their hearts beat with determination. As they prepared to charge into battle, Moses climbed a nearby hill accompanied by Aaron and Hur, two men he trusted deeply. Moses carried the staff of God, the same staff that had brought plagues upon Egypt, parted the Red Sea, and struck life-giving water from the rock. It was not a symbol merely of power but of God's presence and faithfulness. From the hilltop, Moses could see the battlefield stretch out below him, the Amalekite warriors advancing with fierce shouts, Joshua's line forming quickly to meet them. The clash began with an eruption of dust and cries. Joshua fought at the front, moving with a strength and precision that belied his inexperience. His men responded to his courage, pressing forward even when fear flickered across their faces. But the Amalekites were seasoned fighters, swift and ruthless, and the battle surged back and forth in a storm of movement. Moses lifted the staff high above his head. As the wood rose into the air, a strange and unmistakable thing happened. Joshua's forces began to push the Amalekites back. Strength surged through Israel's line. Their strikes landed true. Their spirits rose. Aaron and Hur exchanged glances, awe filling their faces. They understood, as long as Moses' hands remained lifted, God granted victory. But the battle stretched on. The sun climbed higher, blazing mercilessly across the desert. Moses' arms trembled under the weight of the staff. Sweat dripped from his brow. His breath grew shallow. Slowly, inevitably, his arms began to lower. And as they sank, the tide of the battle shifted. The Amalekites surged forward, their warriors striking with renewed ferocity. Israel faltered, retreating under the sudden pressure. Moses gasped as he realized the connection. His lifted arms were tied to Israel's strength. The battle below reflected his posture above. With a groan of effort, Moses forced his arms upward once more. Instantly, the battle shifted again. Joshua's men rallied, pushing the enemy back. Hope surged through Israel's ranks. Moses clenched his jaw, determined not to let his hands drop. But his muscles burned, his shoulders shook, and exhaustion quickly overtook him. Aaron and Hur could see that Moses could not sustain this alone. They rushed to his side, supporting his trembling arms. But even their strength was not enough to hold him steady for the long battle ahead. Without hesitating, Aaron and Hur dragged a large stone to the hilltop and urged Moses to sit upon it. Then, standing on either side of him, they each took hold of one of his arms, Aaron on the right, Hur on the left. They braced themselves and held Moses' hands high toward heaven. The three men stood bound in a single act of unity, one leading, two supporting, all trusting in the God who gave victory. Down below, Joshua fought with renewed vigor. Inspired by the sight of Moses' raised staff silhouetted against the sky, he and his men pressed forward with everything within them. They struck again and again, driving the Amalekites back step by step. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the battlefield. And at last, as evening approached, Joshua landed a decisive blow. The Amalekite forces broke, scattering across the wilderness, fleeing in defeat. Israel stood victorious. From the hilltop, Moses watched with gratitude filling his weary heart. God had fought for Israel, not through power alone, but through faith, obedience, and unity. Moses lowered the staff at last, and Aaron and Hur helped him rise to his feet. Together they looked over the battlefield, the air heavy with dust and the scent of effort. God had delivered them once again. As the dust of battle slowly settled over the rocky plain of Rephidim, the sound of clashing swords faded into the distant silence of the wilderness. Joshua and his men stood breathless, bruised, sweat-soaked, and exhausted, yet their eyes shone with a fire they had never known before. They had fought, and they had prevailed. The bodies of fallen Amalekite warriors lay scattered across the field, their weapons abandoned, their fierce cries replaced by the whisper of wind moving through the desert. Israel, a nation of former slaves who had never been trained for war, had faced a ruthless enemy and emerged victorious. But every man among them knew the truth: this victory did not come from their strength alone. It came from the God who had been with them, who fought when Moses' hands were lifted and who empowered Joshua's every strike. Moses, Aaron, and Hur descended from the hilltop slowly, Moses leaning heavily on his staff. His arms still ached from the strain of holding them aloft for so many hours, and his face carried both exhaustion and reverent awe. As he reached the camp, the people greeted him with relief, gratitude, and wonder, for they had seen the connection between their leader's raised hands and the turning tide of the battle. Many had watched from afar as the silhouette of Moses, flanked by Aaron and Hur, stood unmoving like a living banner of faith against the sky. And now, as the fighting men returned to camp, cheers and tears met them. Wives embraced their husbands. Children clung to their fathers' legs. Elders lifted their eyes to heaven in gratitude. The miracle of the rock was still fresh in their minds, and now another miracle, equally impossible, had unfolded before their eyes. Joshua approached Moses, dust covering his face and garments, his sword still in his hand. Though weary, he carried himself with a new strength, a confidence born not of pride but of witnessing firsthand the faithfulness of God. Moses placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of the young warrior's breath. In Joshua, Moses saw courage that would one day carry Israel into promised territory. In Joshua, God was shaping a leader. But the victory needed to be remembered, not as a triumph of men, but as a testimony to the God who delivered them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses with clear and commanding purpose: "Write this as a memorial in a scroll and recite it to Joshua, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven." Moses felt the weight of those words. God was declaring war not merely on a tribe, but on the wickedness Amalek represented: violence against the weak, bitterness against God's people, and hatred rooted in cruelty. This battle was only the beginning of a long conflict that would span generations. Joshua had fought bravely today, but he needed to understand that the struggle against Amalek would continue. Moses obeyed, recording the account, ensuring that both the victory and the warning would never be forgotten. The story would shape Joshua's future, preparing him to lead battles far greater than this one. But the memorial God desired was not only written, it was built. Moses, moved by reverence, began to gather stones from the ground, selecting each one carefully. The people watched as he constructed an altar on the very hill where he had stood during the battle. Aaron and Hur assisted him, lifting the larger stones into place, their hands steady as they built a monument not to the strength of Israel but to the power of their God. When the altar was complete, Moses stepped back, lifted his staff once more, and declared the name of the altar: Yahweh Nissi, the Lord is my banner. The name echoed across the camp like a proclamation of identity. Israel did not march under the banner of kings or armies. Their banner was the Lord Himself, the one who went before them in a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, who gave manna from heaven and water from stone, who defeated armies with the lifting of a staff and the unity of His people. Under His banner, Israel was protected. Under His banner, they were strengthened. Under His banner, they would march forward into the future. Moses looked over the altar, feeling the weight of its meaning. This was more than a pile of stones. It was a testimony of partnership, God's power and Israel's obedience working together. Moses had lifted his hands toward heaven, but he had not stood alone. Aaron and Hur had supported him. Joshua had fought below. The elders had witnessed the miracle. The people had cried out to God. The victory belonged to the Lord, but the unity of Israel had revealed the beauty of faith in action. Without Aaron and Hur, Moses' arms would have fallen. Without Moses, Joshua would have faltered. Without Joshua, the people would have fallen. Each played a role. Each part mattered. And through their unity, God's power flowed unhindered. As the sun dipped behind the distant cliffs, casting long shadows across the desert, Moses gathered the people around the newly built altar. He retold the story of the battle, how the Amalekites attacked the weak, how Joshua fought with courage, how God gave victory when the staff was raised. Children listened with wide eyes. Mothers held their little ones close. Warriors stood proudly yet humbly, knowing their strength had come from God. Moses lifted his voice and declared, "The Lord will be at war against Amalek from generation to generation." The people nodded solemnly, understanding that this battle was not simply about land or power. It was about righteousness, justice, and the protection of the vulnerable. That night, when the camp finally grew quiet, Moses sat beside the altar, gazing at the flickering flames of nearby campfires. The desert was peaceful, the sound of flowing water from the rock murmuring in the distance. Moses felt gratitude rise in his heart, not only for the victory but for the people God had shaped through it. The wilderness was teaching them, refining them, molding them into a nation that trusted the Lord in every circumstance. Victory had come, but not without struggle. Provision had come, but not without need. And through it all, God remained faithful. As Moses watched the stars spread across the sky like scattered diamonds, he knew their journey was far from over. There would be more tests, more challenges, more moments when faith would falter and God's grace would intervene. But for now, Israel had a memorial. They had a banner. They had a victory that would echo through generations. And beneath the quiet desert night, the altar of Yahweh Nissi stood as a beacon of hope, a reminder that the God who fought for them today would lead them tomorrow. In the days following the battle with Amalek, the camp of Israel slowly returned to its rhythm of wandering life. The people tended to their families, gathered manna each morning, drank from the flowing water of the rock, and rested beneath the vast desert sky. Yet beneath the surface of daily tasks lay the weight of leadership pressing heavily upon Moses' shoulders. With each sunrise, a line of people formed outside his tent, men and women seeking guidance, justice, answers, or comfort. Disputes about grazing animals, conflicts between neighbors, questions about God's commands, and concerns about the journey filled the air from morning until night. Moses listened patiently to each voice, offering decisions, wisdom, and peace. But the line never seemed to shorten. From dawn to dusk, he stood as the sole judge and counselor for a nation numbering in the hundreds of thousands. The burden grew heavier by the day, though he bore it silently, believing it was his responsibility alone. One morning, as the sun lifted above the rugged cliffs and the people began gathering once more with their grievances, a newcomer approached the outskirts of the camp, a familiar figure riding a modest donkey, surrounded by a few attendants. It was Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, who had heard the stories of Israel's deliverance. Jethro brought with him Moses' wife, Zipporah, and their 2 sons, Gershom and Eleazar. Years had passed since Moses had sent his family back to Midian for safety. Now they returned, drawn by news of God's mighty works. As Moses saw them approaching, his heart leaped with joy. He hurried forward, bowed respectfully before Jethro, and embraced him warmly. Then he knelt to greet his sons, lifting them into his arms as Zipporah smiled softly, relief and affection brightening her face. Moses welcomed them into his tent, offering food, water, and rest after their long journey. That evening, Moses told Jethro everything the Lord had done, how God struck Egypt with plagues, how the Red Sea had opened before them, how the manna fell each morning, how water gushed from the rock, and how Amalek had been defeated by God's power. Jethro listened with awe, his wise eyes shining with reverence. When Moses finished, Jethro lifted his hands toward heaven and declared, "Praise be to the Lord, who rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all other gods." He offered sacrifices, and Aaron and the elders joined him in a sacred meal before the Lord. It was a moment of unity, Midianite and Israelite together, acknowledging the God who ruled over all nations. The next morning, Jethro rose early and watched Moses take his seat outside the tent as the people gathered with their disputes. The line stretched endlessly. Jethro observed quietly as Moses listened to case after case, settling family disagreements, instructing the people in God's ways, resolving conflicts with fairness and compassion. Hours passed. The sun climbed high and beat down mercilessly. Still Moses listened. Still the people waited. When the final dispute was settled and the sun dipped low, Jethro approached Moses, concern etched in his face. "What is this you are doing for the people?" he asked. "Why do you alone sit as judge while all these people stand around you from morning till evening?" Moses wiped the sweat from his brow, weary but resolute. "The people come to me to seek God's will," he explained. "Whenever they have a dispute, they bring it to me, and I decide between them. I teach them God's decrees and instructions." There was sincerity in his voice, but also exhaustion that he could not hide. Jethro listened, nodding slowly. Then he spoke with the gentle firmness of a father offering wisdom. "What you are doing is not good. You and these people who come to you will wear yourselves out. The work is too heavy, you cannot handle it alone." The words struck Moses like a blow of truth. He had believed he must bear the entire weight of leadership. He had assumed that every question, every dispute, every burden belonged on his shoulders because God had chosen him. But Jethro saw clearly what Moses could not: leadership without support leads to collapse. Moses waited silently as Jethro continued, "Listen now to me, and may God be with you. You must be the people's representative before God, bringing their disputes to him. Teach them his decrees and instructions. Show them the way they are to live. But select capable men from among the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens." Jethro's words painted a new structure, a vision of shared leadership. Moses would still guide, teach, and seek God's will, but he would no longer bear every burden alone. These chosen men would handle the simple cases, while the difficult matters would come to Moses. "If you do this," Jethro concluded, "you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied." The wisdom was simple yet profound. Moses realized that God had sent Jethro not only to reunite him with his family but to strengthen the nation through counsel. Moses accepted Jethro's advice with humility. He gathered the people and chose capable men, leaders known for their integrity, respect, and godly fear. He appointed them according to their ability, assigning some to oversee thousands, others hundreds, others 50s, and still others 10s. Order replaced chaos. Where once Moses stood alone, now a team of righteous leaders stood beside him, sharing the responsibility of guiding the people. The disputes no longer stretched across endless hours. The people could seek justice quickly, and Moses was freed to focus on teaching, interceding, and seeking God's direction for the entire nation. Jethro watched the transformation with satisfaction. He saw Moses walk with lighter steps, speak with renewed strength, and lead with greater clarity. The people, too, felt the difference. Justice flowed more easily. Wisdom reached more ears. Burdens lifted from both leader and community. After several days, when Jethro knew his purpose had been fulfilled, he prepared to return to his homeland. Moses escorted him to the edge of the camp, gratitude shining in his eyes. They embraced one final time, and Jethro departed, leaving behind not only family ties restored but a legacy of wise counsel that would shape Israel's future. As Moses watched his father-in-law disappear into the distance, he felt strengthened, not by a miracle of water or a victory in battle, but by the gift of wisdom shared at just the right moment. The wilderness was teaching them many lessons: trust, obedience, endurance, unity. And now, through Jethro, God had taught Moses that even the strongest leaders need support. The journey ahead would still bring challenges, but Moses no longer carried the load alone. God had provided leaders, structure, and wisdom, preparing Israel for the day they would stand before the mountain of God. The morning air in the wilderness carried a new kind of stillness, one that seemed to rest upon Israel like an invisible cloak as the people began to pack their tents and gather their belongings. The pillar of cloud, which had guided them for months through valleys of fear and peaks of triumph, had risen early and hovered with a sense of purpose unlike before. Its slow, deliberate movement hinted that something significant lay ahead, something greater than manna, greater than water from a rock, greater even than victory over Amalek. Moses sensed it in his spirit, a quiet stirring that drew his gaze toward the horizon where jagged mountain peaks rose like ancient guardians carved from the earth. Among them stood one that towered above the rest, Mount Sinai, a dark, formidable silhouette against the brightening sky. As the people began to move, a quiet awe spread through the camp, for they felt in their bones that they were approaching a place chosen by God. The journey toward Sinai was unlike any they had taken before. Though the desert still stretched endlessly around them, though the sun still beat down relentlessly, the people walked with a strange anticipation. Whispered questions passed between families: what lies ahead? Why does the cloud lead us here? What will God do next? Moses walked near the front, his staff in hand, his eyes drawn repeatedly toward the mountain. He had encountered God once before in that region, in flames that did not consume, in a voice that called his name, in holiness so overwhelming that he had removed his sandals in trembling reverence. Now, returning with an entire nation behind him, he wondered what divine purpose awaited them. The closer they came, the more the landscape changed. The ground grew rockier, the cliffs steeper, and the wind carried the scent of stone and silence. At last, after days of steady travel, Israel entered the wilderness of Sinai, a sprawling plain at the foot of the towering mountain. The people spread across the valley, pitching their tents, gathering water from nearby streams, settling in the wide expanse that seemed designed for an assembly of nations. The mountain loomed above them, dark, rugged, and majestic, its summit veiled in clouds even when the skies around it were clear. It was as though the mountain itself waited for the arrival of the God who would soon descend upon it. Moses stood at the base, looking up with a mixture of awe and familiarity. The place where God had spoken to him when he was a shepherd in Midian would now become the place where God would speak to an entire people. The next morning, Moses ascended partway up the mountain, stepping carefully over jagged stones until he reached a quiet place where the wind whispered through the rocks. There, God called to him from the heights, his voice echoing with both power and tenderness. "This is what you are to say to the house of Jacob, and what you are to tell the people of Israel." Moses bowed his head, listening intently as the Lord spoke. God reminded him of all that he had done, how he carried Israel on eagle's wings out of Egypt, how he brought them to himself with purpose and protection. Then came a declaration that would shape their identity forever: "If you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all nations. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Moses felt the weight and wonder of those words settle deeply into his soul. Israel was not just a wandering group of freed slaves. They were chosen, set apart, called into a covenant relationship with the God of heaven. With urgency and awe, Moses descended the mountain to deliver the message. The elders gathered before him as he spoke God's words to the people, and a wave of reverence rippled through the assembly. Without hesitation, the people responded with one voice: "All that the Lord has spoken, we will do." Their commitment rose like incense into the warm desert air. Moses returned to God with the people's answer, climbing the mountain once more. And the Lord replied, giving instructions that would prepare Israel to meet him in a way no people on earth had ever experienced. God told Moses, "I am coming to you in a thick cloud so that the people may hear me when I speak with you and trust you forever." But before that moment could come, the people needed preparation, not of weapons or supplies, but of hearts and bodies. Moses descended again and instructed the nation, "Consecrate yourselves. Wash your garments. Prepare for the third day. Do not approach the mountain. Do not touch its base. For on the third day, the Lord himself would descend upon Sinai in the sight of all Israel." The camp buzzed with a mixture of excitement and trembling fear. Families hurried to wash clothing, children splashed in basins, elders examined their tents, ensuring everything was in order. The air itself felt heavier, charged with something too holy to describe. The mountain stood silent, yet expectant, as if listening to the heartbeat of heaven. That night, as darkness settled over the plain, the people sat together in small clusters, speaking softly about what the third day might bring. Would they see God's glory? Would they hear his voice? Would the ground shake beneath them? Even the youngest children sensed something profound was coming. On the morning of the second day, Moses led the people to mark a boundary around the foot of the mountain, ropes, stones, and clear warnings ensuring that no one crossed the line God had commanded. The boundary became a visible reminder that God was holy, set apart, and that his presence demanded reverence. Clouds thickened around the summit, swirling like smoke from an unseen fire. The winds grew stronger, bending the grasses and whipping the tents. Fathers held their children close. Mothers whispered prayers. Moses stood before the people, his eyes fixed on the peak, knowing the next day would change everything. When dawn broke on the third day, the valley shuddered. A sound like rolling thunder echoed across the plain, and lightning cracked through the sky despite the clouded summit. The mountain trembled violently, smoke rising from its peak as though it were a furnace blazing from within. A trumpet blast, loud, long, and unnatural, pierced the air, causing the people to cover their ears in fear. Yet Moses stepped forward, steady and calm, for he recognized the voice of heaven calling. The people drew back, trembling, their hearts pounding as they watched the mountain blaze with divine fire. The moment of meeting had come. God was descending. And Israel, standing at the foot of Sinai, would soon hear the voice that shaped creation itself. The dawn of the third day rose with a tension unlike anything Israel had ever felt. A strange stillness lay over the camp, as if every grain of sand waited for a command from heaven. Families gathered near their tents whispering anxiously, shepherds quieted their flocks, and children clung to their parents' robes with wide, uncertain eyes. Moses stood near the boundary line at the base of Mount Sinai, watching as the first rays of sunlight struggled to pierce the thick, swirling cloud that wrapped itself tightly around the summit. The mountain looked alive, brooding, restless, shrouded in smoke as though an invisible fire smoldered deep within its heart. Above it, the sky churned with dark clouds streaked with flashes of lightning, as if the heavens themselves were preparing for a divine descent. Then, without warning, a thunderous blast echoed across the wilderness. It was not the sound of any trumpet made by human hands. It was deeper, louder, more powerful, like the very breath of God shaking the air. The people jolted in fear, some falling to their knees, others clinging tightly to one another. Moses felt the vibration of the sound pulsing through the ground beneath his feet. Every heartbeat in Israel synchronized in one shared moment of awe and terror. The mountain quaked. The rocks trembled. The air thickened until it felt almost solid. It was as if creation itself bowed under the weight of the one who spoke it into existence. Smoke billowed upward from the mountain in towering columns, dark and dense like the smoke of a great furnace. Flames flickered within it, casting eerie orange glows through the billowing cloud. The heat radiating from the mountain was intense, and even those standing at a distance felt its scorching breath. The thunder grew louder, rolling across the plain with earth-shaking force, and lightning flashed again and again in jagged streaks that split the sky with blinding brilliance. Every sound, every movement of the mountain declared the same truth: the Almighty had come down. The trumpet blast sounded again, longer, louder, more piercing than before. The people covered their ears, trembling violently, unable to withstand the overwhelming sound. But Moses stood tall, though his heart pounded fiercely. He understood this was the summons from God. As the blast stretched to a shuddering crescendo, Moses lifted his staff and stepped forward toward the boundary. Behind him, the people watched with reverence and dread. They dared not cross the boundary, for the command of God had been clear: any who touched the mountain would die. Holiness was drawing near, and holiness could not be approached casually. Moses walked with steady steps until he reached the very edge of the boundary. Then, at God's command, he crossed it and began ascending the trembling mountain. The ground shook beneath him, stones rattled loose and tumbled down the slopes, and the smoke thickened so heavily that each breath felt like inhaling fire. Yet Moses pressed on, climbing toward the summit where God's presence burned like a living flame. As he climbed higher, the thunder softened into a low, resonant hum, as if Moses had stepped into the heart of the storm where sound itself bowed to the presence of the Lord. When Moses reached a certain point on the mountain, God spoke to him through the enveloping cloud, his voice deep, commanding, and filled with power. "Go down and warn the people," God said, "so they do not break through to look at me. Even the priests must consecrate themselves, or I will break out against them." Moses listened, though he knew the people already trembled with fear far too great to even consider crossing the boundary. Still, God's holiness required obedience, not assumptions. Moses bowed his head and descended quickly, his cloak whipping in the fierce winds swirling around the mountain. When he returned to the camp, he found the people huddled together, fear etched deeply on every face. Their eyes darted between Moses and the blazing mountain as if unsure which sight terrified them more. Moses raised his voice above the rolling thunder and the crackling fire, delivering God's warning. The people nodded vigorously, pressing farther back from the boundary. No one wanted to take a single step closer to the trembling mountain. They understood with painful clarity that the God who rescued them from Egypt was not a tame deity, not a God shaped by human hands, not one to be bargained with or manipulated. He was holy, powerful, and utterly beyond comprehension. Then, at God's call, Moses once again approached the boundary and began his ascent. This time Aaron remained at the base, awaiting the instructions Moses would bring down. As Moses climbed, the mountain continued to quake violently, and the cloud thickened until it was impossible to see more than a few steps ahead. The voice of God thundered from the summit, and Moses pressed toward it until he reached the place where God's presence rested like a blazing fire hidden within the cloud. There, God declared words that would shape the identity of Israel forever. He spoke not only to Moses but to all the people, his voice carrying down the mountain in thunderous waves. The people below fell to their knees, overcome by terror and reverence. They heard the voice that carved the stars, the voice that formed the earth, the voice that called Abraham, the voice that judged Egypt, the voice that commanded the sea to part. And now that voice spoke to them, revealing the laws that would define righteousness, justice, worship, and the covenant relationship between God and his chosen people. The mountain shook with every word. Smoke rose like incense. Fire flickered like divine breath. The people trembled uncontrollably, unable to stand beneath the weight of God's nearness. When at last the voice ceased, a profound silence fell across the wilderness. The people turned to Moses with fear still gripping their souls and cried out, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us directly, or we will die." Moses understood their fear, for he too had felt the overwhelming truth of God's holiness. But he also knew the purpose behind this revelation. "Do not be afraid," he told them gently. "God has come to test you, so that the fear of him will be with you and keep you from sin." As Moses returned to the mountain once more to receive further instructions, the people remained at a distance, their eyes fixed on the place where heaven had touched earth. Sinai still shuddered. The cloud still swirled. The fire still burned. Something extraordinary had taken place. God had spoken to his people, revealing not only his power but his desire for a relationship with them. Israel understood that they were chosen, set apart, and called to a life shaped not by fear of enemies or hunger in the wilderness, but by the voice of the one who shook the mountain and wrote his law upon their hearts. When Moses descended from the shuddering heights of Sinai after God's voice had rolled like thunder across the wilderness, the people still stood trembling at a distance, their faces pale with awe and fear. The echoes of divine speech seemed to vibrate in the very air around them, lingering like the residue of lightning after a great storm. Smoke continued to rise from the mountain in thick, twisting columns, and flickers of fire glowed within the cloud that wrapped the summit like a crown forged of heaven's own flame. No one dared to move closer, for they knew with absolute certainty that God's holiness burned on that mountain, and to cross the boundary would mean death. Yet it was from this place of overwhelming majesty that God called Israel into a covenant, inviting them to become his treasured possession. Moses, having been summoned again by the Lord, prepared himself to ascend once more into the trembling heart of Sinai, where God would give commands that would shape not just Israel's life, but the moral fabric of nations for generations to come. The people watched as he walked toward the boundary line, their hearts pounding with anticipation and reverence. They had begged Moses to speak for them, to stand between themselves and the thunderous voice that had shaken their souls. And Moses, still carrying the awe of God's presence within him, strode forward with a steadiness born of divine calling. As he crossed the boundary and began his ascent, the mountain groaned under the weight of God's nearness, its stones quivering with every step he took. The cloud swallowed him quickly, and once again he vanished from human sight, hidden within the fire-laced darkness of the divine presence. Inside the cloud, the world felt different, as though Moses walked not on earthly ground but through the threshold of heaven itself. The air pulsed with energy, charged with something beyond comprehension. Moses shielded his face, overwhelmed, yet the Lord sustained him. Then God spoke again, his voice no longer as thunder meant for all the people but as the commanding, intimate sound meant for his chosen servant. And God declared his covenant, the foundation of Israel's identity and the pillars of righteousness for all humanity. I am the Lord your God, he proclaimed, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. With these words, God anchored his law in relationship, reminding Israel not of fear, but redemption. Moses listened with his soul open wide as God spoke the commandments that would define holiness. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make idols. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. Honor your father and mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet. Each command fell with the weight of eternal truth, shaping a people who would reflect God's character in their lives, their families, and their community. While Moses received these words, the people below waited in uneasy silence. The smoke still rose, the flashes of lightning still cracked across the summit, and the quaking of the mountain came in unsettling waves. Children clung to their mothers, elders leaned on staffs, and warriors stood with humbled expressions, realizing that even their strength meant nothing before the God who melted stone beneath his feet. Conversations were hushed, reverent, and filled with uncertainty. Will Moses return? Some whispered. What more will God say? Others reflected on the commandments they had heard directly before fear drove them back. These laws were unlike anything known to the nations around them. They were not born of human wisdom or tradition but flowed from the holiness of the Creator. Israel realized with trembling awe that they were being shaped into a nation set apart not by power, but by righteousness. High upon the mountain, the Lord continued giving Moses instructions beyond the 10 Commandments, commands about altars, worship, justice, compassion, and community life. God spoke of how Israel must treat the poor, the stranger, the widow, and the orphan. He spoke of honesty, restitution, fairness, and the protection of human dignity. He gave laws about festivals that would remind Israel of his faithfulness, and practices that would distinguish them from every other nation. Each word carried divine purpose. Moses, though overwhelmed, absorbed everything with the attention of one who knew he was being entrusted with something of immeasurable weight. Hours passed, perhaps even days, for time itself felt different in the presence of the Eternal. Then the Lord instructed Moses to descend once more and present these laws to the people, to ask them if they would enter into this covenant. Moses emerged from the cloud like a man returning from another world, his face etched with the brilliance of what he had witnessed. As he walked down the slopes, the people surged forward but stopped well short of the boundary. They stared as though seeing him for the first time, sensing something changed in him, a gravity, a radiance, a solemnity born of divine encounter. Moses gathered the elders and the people before him and proclaimed all the words the Lord had spoken, the commandments, the statutes, and the ordinances. As the people listened, a hush fell over the camp. Not one person spoke until Moses finished. Then, with unity deeper than fear, with reverence stronger than doubt, the entire nation answered with one voice, "All the words the Lord has spoken, we will do." Moses recorded everything God said, writing down the words that would form the book of the covenant. Early the next morning, he built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 pillars to represent the 12 tribes. Burnt offerings and fellowship offerings were presented before the Lord. Moses took half of the blood from the sacrifices and placed it in bowls, and the other half he sprinkled on the altar, signifying God's part in the covenant. Then he read the book of the covenant aloud to the people. Again, they responded, "We will do everything the Lord has said, we will obey." Moses then took the remaining blood and sprinkled it on the people, declaring, "This is the blood of the covenant that the Lord has made with you in accordance with all these words." With this sacred act, the covenant was sealed, heaven binding itself to a people on earth, and a people binding themselves to their God. The mountain still trembled. The smoke still rose. The fire still burned. But now Israel stood not merely as spectators of God's power, but as participants in his promise. They belonged to him by covenant, called to holiness, shaped by his word, and destined to carry his light into the world. When the covenant had been sealed, and the words of the Lord were spoken and accepted by the people with trembling obedience, a deep hush settled across the vast camp spread beneath Mount Sinai. The smoke continued to coil upward from the summit like a living banner of divine fire, and the air still hummed with the remnants of heavenly thunder. Israel stood as though suspended between earth and eternity, aware that something monumental had taken place. They were no longer simply a rescued people, they were a covenant people. But even in this sacred stillness, God had more to reveal. Moses, weary yet strengthened by the gravity of his calling, stepped away from the altar as the last embers of the sacrificial fires dimmed. His eyes were drawn once more to the blazing heights of Sinai, and he knew with certainty that the God who had spoken in fire was not finished with him. The Lord summoned Moses again, not to deliver words to the people, but to draw nearer into his presence. And this time, Moses would not go alone. Moses gathered Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, calling them to accompany him toward the mountain. The people watched with wide eyes as these leaders, men chosen for their wisdom and faithfulness, stepped forward in solemn procession. They were stepping toward a mystery, toward a place no other nation had ever been invited to approach. Though they did not cross the boundary that Moses alone could cross fully, they ascended partway up the mountain to a height where the earth seemed to tremble and the very air shimmered with holiness. There, something astonishing happened, something that would be whispered about for generations. These 70 elders, along with Aaron and his sons, saw a glimpse of God. Not his face, not the fullness of his glory, but a manifestation so radiant that their hearts nearly faltered. Beneath his feet was something like a pavement made of sapphire, clear as the purest sky. It was as though the heavens themselves lay beneath him like a foundation of impossible beauty. And even though the leaders saw this vision, the Lord did not stretch out his hand against them. Instead, they ate and drank in his presence, partaking in a sacred meal that signified peace, acceptance, and fellowship with the Almighty. After this divine encounter, Moses alone was called to come higher still. The Lord's voice, deep and commanding, echoed from within the cloud, saying, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay there, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and commandments I have written for their instruction." Moses turned toward the people once more, instructing them to remain where they were. He appointed Aaron and Hur to judge any matters that might arise, for he knew his ascent would not be brief. Joshua, his faithful attendant, stood ready at his side. Together they began to climb into the swirling darkness above. The mountain shook beneath their feet, and the wind howled around them like the breath of angels. As they climbed, the brightness grew more intense, the air hotter and heavier, until they reached the threshold of the cloud, a barrier of divine mystery that obscured everything within. Joshua remained at a distance, but Moses stepped forward boldly, disappearing into the cloud, swallowed by the fire of God's presence. From below, the people watched in awe and fear. The glory of the Lord settled upon Mount Sinai like a consuming fire. By day, it appeared as a blazing crown of flame; by night, it glowed with a radiance that turned the mountain into a torch piercing the darkness of the wilderness. The people saw Moses vanish into that fire, and though they trusted him, fear stirred in their hearts. Days passed. 6 days Moses remained within the cloud, waiting in silent reverence. The 7th day, God called to him from within the fire, and Moses entered deeper still. The heat was fierce, yet it did not consume him. The light was blinding, yet it did not destroy him. He walked in a realm where heaven touched earth, where divine holiness and human obedience met. Inside the glory, God spoke to Moses about sacred things: the pattern of the tabernacle, the Ark of the Covenant, the lampstands of pure gold, the priestly garments, and the rituals that would allow sinful humanity to meet with a holy God. God described a sanctuary not born from human imagination but revealed directly by his own design. "Make it exactly as I show you," the Lord commanded. These were not mere instructions, they were blueprints for a dwelling place where God would live among his people. The tabernacle would be a place of meeting, a place of mercy, a place of atonement. Through it, the God who descended in thunder and fire would dwell with Israel not only on the mountain but in their daily lives. Moses listened, recording every word with the seriousness of a man who understood that future generations would depend on his faithfulness. God spoke of offerings, priesthood, consecration, and holiness. He described altars, measurements, fabrics, and rituals with precision. Nothing was left to chance. God was teaching Moses how heaven touches earth, how a holy God dwells among imperfect people through grace and sacrifice. Moses remained in that glory for 40 days and 40 nights, sustained by the presence of God alone. No food. No water. Only divine communion. The same God who had spoken the universe into being now spoke to Moses with intimate authority, entrusting him with a covenant that would shape the destiny of Israel. Meanwhile, the people below watched the blazing summit with growing questions. Some whispered anxiously, wondering when Moses would return. Others debated what his prolonged absence meant. Though fear still lingered from the day God's voice thundered from Sinai, impatience began to stir like a dangerous ember. They saw the fire but not the purpose. They felt the distance but not the holiness. They did not yet know that while they waited, God Himself was crafting the means by which He would dwell among them. Moses, immersed in glory, continued receiving the divine pattern, unaware of the restlessness brewing below. God was giving His law, His presence, His dwelling place. Everything was being prepared. But while heaven worked, earth wavered. The stage was being set not only for divine revelation but for a test that would reveal the heart of a nation. The days stretched on like endless strands of desert wind as Israel remained camped at the foot of Mount Sinai, watching the blazing summit with a mixture of fear and fascination. At first, every glance toward the mountain stirred awe in their hearts. The fire, the smoke, the trembling earth, all testified that God Himself rested upon the heights. The people whispered to one another about Moses, wondering what mysteries he was hearing within the divine cloud, what revelations he was bringing back for them. But as the days slipped into weeks, and the fire on the mountain burned steadily without a sign of Moses' return, awe slowly gave way to uncertainty. And uncertainty, once it finds a foothold in the human heart, often grows into doubt. Mothers kept their children close, their eyes wandering to the horizon for any sign of Moses. Warriors stood at the edge of the camp, staring upward with arms folded, trying to mask the unease creeping into their thoughts. Elders whispered among themselves, counting the days, then losing track, then counting again. Joshua's lingering presence partway up the mountain was a faint comfort, but he too was silent, focused, waiting. Every morning, the manna fell faithfully, reminding them of God's provision, yet even daily miracles began to feel ordinary against the silence of Moses' absence. People began to ask questions they once feared to speak. Why has Moses not returned? Is he still alive? Has the fire consumed him? What will happen to us if he does not come back? Aaron, left in charge, tried to maintain order, though his own heart wavered. He had not climbed the mountain with Moses, had not remained in the cloud for those 6 days of silence and 40 days of revelation. He only knew what the people knew: Moses had vanished into the glory of God and had not returned. At first, the people approached Aaron respectfully, seeking reassurance. "Aaron," they asked, "how long will Moses remain there?" Or, "Aaron, what did the Lord tell him to do?" But as time pressed on, their patience thinned. Some longed for the familiar structures of Egypt, where at least they knew what each day would bring. Others felt frightened by the vastness of their freedom that required trust, obedience, and dependence on a God they could not see. The mountain blazed, but Israel's faith flickered. As doubt grew, so did murmuring. Small groups gathered outside their tents in the evenings, whispering anxiously. A few bolder voices spoke openly, "We need leadership we can see. Moses has abandoned us. We are alone in this wilderness." The voices gained traction like a snowball rolling downhill, gathering speed and mass. At last, a restless crowd formed. First dozens. Then hundreds. Then more. Their frustration, fear, and impatience pushed them toward Aaron like a rising tide. The leaders of the impatient group stood at the front, their faces stern, their voices loud with urgency and agitation. Aaron stepped back instinctively as they approached. They bowed only briefly before speaking the words that would shake the camp to its core, "Make us gods who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of Egypt, we do not know what has happened to him." Aaron's heart froze. The request was shocking, unthinkable, and yet the determination in the people's eyes made it clear they would not turn back easily. Fear stirred within him, not fear of God, though it should have been, but fear of the people. He felt the pressure of their expectations, their rising anger, their desperation. He searched for words, for courage, for a way to redirect them, but doubt clouded his judgment. Instead of standing firm as Moses would have done, Aaron hesitated, and in that hesitation, a dangerous decision took shape. "Take off the gold earrings your wives, your sons, and your daughters are wearing," he said, "and bring them to me." Some thought this would discourage the people. But instead, they hurried eagerly to comply, stripping gold from their ears and hands and garments. The pile of gold grew quickly in Aaron's hands, gold that had once been plundered from Egypt under God's command, now offered for rebellion. Aaron melted the gold, shaping it with tools into the form of a calf, a symbol familiar to Egypt, a shape that embodied strength, fertility, and earthly power. When he lifted the finished idol for the crowd to see, a roar of approval erupted. "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt," they shouted. The words pierced the air like a dagger against the covenant they had just sworn to keep. Aaron, swept along by the people's fervor, built an altar in front of the idol and announced, "Tomorrow there will be a festival to the Lord." But it was not the Lord they honored. Early the next morning, the people rose, bringing burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, dancing with reckless abandon around the glittering calf. What began as doubt had become disobedience. What began as impatience had become idolatry. The covenant that had been sealed with blood now stood on the brink of violation. High on the mountain, Moses remained in the presence of God, unaware of the chaos unfolding below. He was receiving the final instructions, the tablets of stone engraved by the very finger of God, a physical testimony of the covenant. But the Lord, who sees all things, spoke with a voice heavy with righteous anger, "Go down, for your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. They have turned aside quickly from what I commanded. They have made for themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf." God's words thundered with grief and wrath as he continued, "Now leave me so that my anger may burn against them and I may destroy them. But I will make you into a great nation." Moses froze, stunned by the news of Israel's rapid rebellion. The people he had interceded for, led, protected, and taught had abandoned the covenant before the ink of God's commandments had even cooled upon the stone. But even in the face of divine wrath, Moses stepped into the role God had shaped him to become: intercessor, shepherd, leader. He pleaded with God, appealing to his mercy, his promises, and his reputation among the nations. "Turn from your fierce anger," Moses begged. remember your servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And in a mystery of divine grace, God relented. Then Moses turned and descended the mountain, carrying the tablets, the sacred stones etched with heavenly words, unaware of the fury building in his heart. As he approached the camp, Joshua joined him, hearing the noise below and mistaking it for battle. But Moses shook his head, his face darkening as the truth became clear. "It is not the sound of victory or defeat," he said grimly. "It is the sound of singing." When the camp came into view and the golden calf gleamed in the sunlight, Moses' anger ignited like the fire on Sinai. Israel had broken the covenant, and the consequences were about to fall. Moses stormed down the slopes of Sinai with a fury that burned as fiercely as the fire that crowned the mountain behind him. In his arms he carried the 2 stone tablets, heavy slabs engraved by the very finger of God, tablets that bore the covenant Israel had so quickly abandoned. Each step echoed with righteous anger, the weight of the stones pressing into his arms like reminders of the promises the people had shattered. Joshua followed closely, his face tense with confusion and disbelief as the sound of celebration rose louder with every stride. It was not the disciplined chant of a military victory or the solemn melody of worship. It was chaos, wild, disorderly, and shameful. As Moses crested the final ridge and the Israelite camp came into full view, he stopped dead in his tracks. Below him, the people danced and shouted around the golden calf, their bodies swaying in frenzied celebration, their voices raised in a twisted parody of worship. Some knelt before the idol, others offered sacrifices, others whirled in reckless circles, intoxicated not by drink but by rebellion. The sight seared Moses' heart. The covenant sealed with blood, the law spoken with thunder, the glory witnessed by every eye, they had thrown it all away in the span of days. Moses' jaw tightened. His eyes blazed. In that moment, he felt not only anger but grief, deep, wrenching grief for a people he loved, a people God had chosen, a people who had abandoned holiness for the glitter of an idol. The golden calf, shining in the sun, was an insult to everything God had revealed. Israel had exchanged the glory of the invisible God for a lifeless statue shaped by human hands. Moses stepped forward, lifting the tablets high. He looked down at the words carved upon them, truth, purity, commands that reflected God's own character. Then he looked at the people, dancing in corruption and disgrace. In that moment, the tablets no longer represented covenant, they represented a covenant broken. With a cry that echoed like thunder, Moses hurled the stone tablets from his hands. They flew through the air, smashing violently against the rocks at the foot of the mountain. The sound of their shattering was like the breaking of a nation's heart. Pieces split and skittered across the ground, symbols of a promise Israel had shattered long before the stones hit the earth. The revelry stopped instantly. All eyes turned toward Moses as the fragments of the tablets lay scattered like fallen stars. Silence fell over the camp. The people froze where they stood, the calf gleaming mockingly between them and their leader. Moses descended the last steps with a stride that made the ground seem to tremble beneath him. He pushed through the stunned crowd and marched straight toward the golden calf. Without hesitation, he seized it, tore it from its pedestal, and dragged it toward the fire that still burned from their offerings. The people watched in stunned horror as Moses hurled the idol into the flames. The gold softened, sagged, and melted until the once proud image was nothing but a bubbling pool of liquid metal. But Moses was not finished. When the gold had melted completely, he scraped it from the ashes, crushed the remnants until they became fine dust, and sprinkled it onto the water that flowed through the camp. Then, in a shocking act that revealed the depth of their sin, he commanded the people to drink it. Israel would taste the bitterness of their rebellion. They would swallow the consequences of their idolatry. With the idol destroyed, Moses turned his blazing eyes on Aaron. The crowd parted as he approached, trembling under his fury. Aaron stepped back instinctively, shame coloring his face. "What did these people do to you," Moses demanded, "that you led them into such great sin?" The question pierced Aaron's heart. He stammered, fumbling for excuses. "You know how prone these people are to evil," he tried. "They said to me, 'Make us gods who will go before us.' So I threw their gold into the fire, and out came this calf." Moses stared at him, stunned by the absurdity of the explanation. It was not the fire that had shaped the idol, it was Aaron's own compromise. His fear of the people had led an entire nation into rebellion. But Moses did not waste more breath on excuses. The time for judgment had come. Seeing the camp in chaos, with people out of control and vulnerable to their enemies, Moses stepped to the entrance of the camp and raised his voice with commanding authority. "Whoever is for the Lord, come to me." His voice rang through the valley, sharp as a prophet's cry. At once, the sons of Levi, the tribe set apart for service, gathered around him, their faces stern with resolve. Moses gave them a painful, devastating command from the Lord: "Go back and forth through the camp and each man kill his brother, friend, and neighbor who has rebelled." It was a judgment severe beyond human understanding, but the sin of idolatry had severed Israel from God's protection and holiness. The Levites obeyed, moving through the camp with heavy hearts and unflinching obedience. That day, about 3,000 men died, those who had refused to turn from the festival, who had given themselves fully to the revelry around the calf. It was a day of mourning, a day Israel would never forget. When the grim work was done, Moses addressed the Levites with solemnity. "You have been set apart to the Lord today," he said, "for you are against your own sons and brothers, and he has blessed you this day." But Moses himself felt no triumph. His heart broke for the people, for the covenant, for the damage done. The next day, as the camp lay in exhausted silence, he gathered the people and said, "You have committed a great sin. Now I will go up to the Lord, perhaps I can make atonement for your sin." He knew the path ahead would require intercession, pleading, and mercy only God could give. Moses climbed the mountain once more, alone, carrying the weight of an entire nation's rebellion on his shoulders. The fire still burned on the summit. The cloud still swirled with divine presence. Moses entered the cloud and fell before the Lord in broken humility. "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed," he prayed. "They made themselves a god of gold. But now, please forgive their sin, but if not, blot me out of the book you have written." In this moment, Moses was willing to sacrifice himself for Israel. He embodied the heart of a true shepherd, a mediator who stood between a holy God and a sinful people. God answered, promising judgment for those who sinned but also promising that his presence would continue to guide Israel. When Moses descended once more, he brought a mixture of judgment and mercy. The people were struck with a plague as a consequence of their sin, yet they were not destroyed. The covenant was wounded but not ended. God had relented because Moses had interceded. The tablets were shattered, but the relationship between God and Israel still had hope, only because of mercy. The days after Moses descended the mountain with the new tablets were unlike anything Israel had ever experienced before. The memory of the golden calf still hung heavily over the camp, a dark shadow of rebellion and shame, yet God's mercy had brought them restoration, and His promise to remain with them breathed new life into their weary hearts. Moses' radiant face became a continual reminder that the presence of God had not departed. Each time he spoke to the people, the glow of his skin shone like a reflection of heaven itself, a visible testimony that God still desired to dwell among them. And now, with the covenant renewed, the Lord gave detailed instructions for something extraordinary: the building of the tabernacle, a sacred dwelling place where His glory would rest in the midst of His people. This was not a mere structure. It was a declaration that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob intended to live among His chosen nation, not on a distant mountain but in their camp, close enough for every man, woman, and child to know His nearness. Moses gathered the entire assembly and delivered the words God had spoken to him on the mountain. His voice carried across the sea of tents as he proclaimed the Lord's instructions, each command given with reverence and precision. The people listened intently as Moses described the Ark of the Covenant with its gold-covered mercy seat, the table for the bread of the presence, the golden lampstand, the altar of incense, the basin for washing, the courtyard, the embroidered curtains, and every vessel that would serve in worship. He told them of the priestly garments, linen ephods, golden chains, jeweled breastpieces, clothing that would set the priests apart for holy service. But Moses said something else, something that stirred the hearts of the people with new purpose: everyone who is willing is to bring an offering to the Lord. No taxes, no coercion, no forced contribution. Only the willing. Only those whose hearts longed to see God dwell among them. What happened next was a miracle of generosity. The people began bringing everything needed for the work: gold jewelry, silver, bronze, blue and purple yarn, fine linen, animal skins, precious stones, spices, oils, wood. Women spun yarn, craftsmen sharpened tools, leaders contributed gems. Day after day the offerings came, so abundant that finally Moses had to command the people to stop giving because there was more than enough. Their repentance had turned into devotion. Their devotion into generosity. Their generosity into a shared longing to see God's presence restored at the very center of their lives. God had chosen 2 men, Bezalel son of Uri and Oholiab son of Ahisamach, to lead the work. They were filled with the Spirit of God, skilled in craftsmanship, artistry, design, and teaching. Under their guidance, the camp buzzed with the sound of construction. Hammers struck gold, chisels shaped wood, looms clattered with woven fabric, and the smell of anointing oil drifted through the air. The entire nation worked together with a unity they had not known since their time in Egypt. This was not simply building a tent, it was building a future. As the tabernacle came together piece by piece, anticipation grew. The people knew that this tent, portable yet sacred, simple in form yet overflowing with meaning, would become the place where heaven met earth. Moses inspected every crafted object with care to ensure that each piece was made exactly according to the pattern God had shown him. Nothing was left to human imagination when it came to the dwelling of God. Every detail mattered. Every measurement spoke of purpose. Every color, every material, every object reflected something deeper than the eye could see. When the final pieces were completed, Moses called the people together once more. The tabernacle was ready to be assembled. The artisans brought forth each element, the frames, the curtains, the gold-covered boards, the altar, the lampstand, the ark with its poles and mercy seat. Moses, at God's command, raised the tabernacle on the first day of the first month of the second year since Israel had left Egypt. It was a moment of fresh beginnings, a symbol that despite failure and rebellion, God was giving his people a new start. With steady hands Moses put everything in place. He set the ark inside the most holy place and hung the veil to shield its glory. He placed the table on the north side, arranged the bread, set the lampstand on the south side, lit its lamps, positioned the altar of incense before the veil, hung the curtain at the entrance, placed the altar of burnt offering in the courtyard, set the basin between the altar and the tent, and filled it with water. He consecrated everything with the anointing oil, marking each object as holy, set apart exclusively for God. Aaron and his sons were washed, clothed, anointed, and consecrated for their priestly duties. The people watched with bated breath. Every movement Moses made carried the weight of a nation's hope. And then, at the very moment the work was completed, something happened that none of them would ever forget. The cloud that had guided Israel from Egypt descended from the sky, thick and radiant, settling over the tabernacle like a crown of divine light. The glory of the Lord filled the tent, so powerfully, so overwhelmingly, that Moses himself could not enter. The brightness pulsed, shimmering like living fire, illuminating the camp with a glow that turned night into day. The people fell to their knees, stunned, trembling, yet filled with awe. For the first time since Eden, God had a dwelling place among his people, and his presence rested not on a mountaintop but in the midst of their camp. From that day on, whenever the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, Israel knew it was time to set out on their journey. When the cloud settled, they remained where they were. By day, the Lord was in the cloud. By night, he appeared as fire over the tent, guiding, protecting, and reminding them that they were never alone. The tabernacle had become their center, their compass, their assurance that God would lead them step by step toward the land he had promised. What had once been a broken covenant was now a restored relationship. What had once been rebellion was now devotion. What had once felt like abandonment had become the assurance of God's nearness. The dwelling of glory stood as a testimony that grace triumphs over failure, that mercy rises above judgment, and that God, in his infinite compassion, chooses to dwell with those who seek him with humble hearts. The night of Israel's deliverance began not with triumph but with trembling hearts and hurried footsteps echoing through the streets of Egypt. After generations of slavery, after plagues that shook the empire to its core, after the final cry that rose from every Egyptian household, Pharaoh had at last commanded them to leave. Moses' voice rang through the camp as families packed their belongings, bread not yet risen, clothes hastily wrapped, lamb's blood still fresh on their doorposts. The people moved like a great river of humanity flowing through the dark streets, carrying with them memories of bondage and hopes of freedom. They did not fully understand the immensity of the moment, but they knew one thing: God himself was leading them out. A pillar of cloud rose before them, glowing faintly in the night, a sign that the God who had struck Egypt would guide his people safely onward. Children clung to their parents, elders leaned on staffs, shepherds drove flocks forward, and the entire nation marched toward an unknown future with the weight of centuries behind them. As dawn approached, they reached Sukkot, then Etham, where the wilderness opened wide before them. It was here that God commanded an unexpected change of direction. Instead of continuing north along the usual trade routes, Moses led the people southward, toward a region hemmed in by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. Many in the crowd felt confusion. Why turn toward a dead end? Why walk into a trap? But Moses obeyed without question because he knew that God's plans rarely fit human logic. In the nights that followed, the pillar of cloud transformed into a pillar of fire, lighting their path with a brilliance unlike anything they had ever seen. It was the greatest assurance they could ask for. God was with them, guiding their every step. Back in Egypt, however, Pharaoh's grief turned quickly to rage. The weight of his loss twisted into bitterness, and he began to question his decision. "What have we done?" he thundered to his officials. "We have let the Israelites go, and we have lost our labor." Fueled by anger and pride, Pharaoh summoned his chariots, 600 of his best, along with every other chariot in Egypt. The thunder of hooves and wheels shook the ground as the army surged forward, determined to chase down the former slaves and drag them back into bondage. Dust rose behind the chariots like a storm cloud, and soon the horizon glimmered with the glint of weapons and armor as the most powerful army in the world raced toward a terrified people trapped between desert and sea. It did not take long for the Israelites to see the approaching army. Panic rippled through the camp like wildfire. Mothers clutched their children, men stared at the sea in dread, and voices rose in fearful cries. Some shouted at Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" Others lamented, "It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die here." The fear was overwhelming, but Moses stood firm. Raising his staff high, he spoke words that cut through the chaos, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the salvation the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you, you need only to be still." Then the Lord spoke to Moses, commanding him to stretch out his hand over the sea so that the waters would divide. But before the miracle began, something extraordinary happened. The pillar of cloud, which had led them from Egypt, moved from before the camp to behind it, placing itself between Israel and the Egyptian army. Throughout the night, one side of the cloud shrouded the Egyptians in darkness, while the other side shone with light for Israel. No army, no weapon, no commander could break through the barrier God Himself had placed between His people and their enemies. Then Moses stepped to the edge of the sea. He lifted his staff, stretched out his hand, and waited. A strong east wind began to blow, soft at first, then steadily growing in power until it howled across the waters. The surface of the sea churned violently, waves twisting and pulling apart as the wind drove them back. Slowly, impossibly, the waters rose like towering walls on both sides, leaving a vast path of dry ground stretching through the very heart of the sea. The people gasped in awe. No human hands could have done this. No natural force could have shaped such a sight. It was the hand of the Almighty carving a road where no road had ever existed. Moses called the people forward, and the first steps into the seabed felt like stepping into a miracle. Mothers carried infants, fathers supported the elderly, and flocks bleated nervously as they moved between walls of water that shimmered like living glass. The sea floor, though freshly revealed, was dry beneath their feet. The wind continued to roar overhead, keeping the waters at bay while lighting the path ahead with an eerie glow. All through the night, the Israelites walked through the sea, a nation moving in silence and wonder. But behind them, the Egyptians pressed forward. When the cloud lifted slightly, Pharaoh saw the path through the water and ordered his chariots to pursue. The army surged onto the seabed, weapons raised, wheels rattling, shouts echoing off the watery walls. But God was not finished. As the chariots pushed deeper into the passage, their wheels began to swerve, sink, and jam. Confusion spread among the soldiers. Panic replaced their confidence. "Let us flee from the Israelites," they cried. "The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." But it was too late. They had stepped into a place meant only for God's people. When the last Israelite set foot safely on the far shore, the Lord spoke again, "Stretch out your hand over the sea." Moses obeyed. As he raised his staff, the wind changed direction. The towering walls of water trembled, then collapsed inward with a thunderous roar. The sea surged over the Egyptian army, swallowing chariots, horses, and soldiers alike. In moments, the path disappeared. When the waters settled, not one of Pharaoh's pursuing warriors remained. The waves washed over the battlefield until the sea lay calm, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But the people knew, this was the day God had fought for them with power unmatched by any empire on earth. As the sun rose over the eastern horizon, its golden light illuminated a scene of overwhelming awe. Israel stood on the shore, breathless, stunned by the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Freedom was no longer a dream, it was reality. God had delivered them with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Then Moses and the Israelites broke into song, an ancient hymn of victory that spilled from their hearts like water from a spring. "The Lord is my strength and my defense, He has become my salvation. The horse and its rider He has hurled into the sea." Miriam, Moses' sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her with tambourines and dancing, singing, "Sing to the Lord, for He is highly exalted." Their celebration rose into the heavens, a chorus of redeemed voices echoing across the desert. Through the waters they had walked. Through the waters they had been delivered. And through the waters, God had revealed Himself as the Savior, Protector, and Redeemer of His people, a truth that generations would remember, retell, and cling to in every trial that lay ahead.